In a small, sleepy town where everyone knew each other's business, there lived a quiet woman who preferred books over big crowds. She wasn't someone you'd notice at first glance, just another face in the crowd, always keeping to herself. But beneath her calm exterior lay a sharp mind and an unshakable sense of fairness. This woman worked as a librarian, spending most of her days surrounded by shelves filled with stories from all over the world. Little did she know that one day, her own life would become a story worth telling. The town had its share of problems, like any other place. One issue stood out more than anything else: corruption. It seemed like those in power often twisted the rules for their benefit, leaving ordinary people feeling helpless. Among them was a judge known for bending laws to suit his interests. He was arrogant, manipulative, and didn't care much about justice unless it served him personally. People whispered about his shady dealings but were too afraid to speak up. After all, crossing him could mean trouble no one wanted to face. One fateful evening, while sorting through some old documents at the library, the librarian stumbled upon something shocking. Hidden within those papers were clues pointing to illegal activities involving the judge. It appeared he had been accepting money from a wealthy developer to approve projects that harmed the environment and displaced families. The discovery left her stunned. How could someone sworn to uphold justice act so dishonestly? Her heart raced as she realized what this meant, not only for the community, but also for anyone brave enough to challenge such wrongdoing. She knew exposing the truth wouldn't be easy. In fact, it could put her in grave danger. Still, she couldn't ignore what she'd found. Doing nothing felt worse than risking everything. So, after careful thought, she decided to report the matter anonymously, hoping authorities would take action without tracing it back to her. Unfortunately, things didn't go as planned. Someone leaked her identity, and soon, whispers spread around town about who had dared to stand against the powerful judge. Before long, retaliation came knocking on her door. Instead of investigating the allegations, the judge filed baseless charges against her, accusing her of conspiring to tarnish his reputation. The news hit the town like wildfire. Everyone talked about how absurd the case was, a harmless librarian being dragged into court over nonsense claims. Yet no one expected her to fight back. They assumed she'd crumble under pressure, especially since the very person she accused would oversee the trial. On the morning of the hearing, she walked into the courtroom clutching a worn notebook, her hands trembling slightly. Despite her nerves, she carried herself with quiet dignity. As she sat alone at the defendant's table, the judge entered the room exuding arrogance. His eyes scanned the room before landing on her, and a smirk played on his lips. "Well, well," he said mockingly, "it seems we have a self-appointed lawyer here today." His tone dripped with sarcasm, clearly intended to intimidate her, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she nodded politely, maintaining her composure. Inside, however, her mind raced. She had spent sleepless nights preparing for this moment, studying every detail of the case and memorizing legal procedures. While others saw her as just another ordinary person caught in a storm, she knew better. This was her chance to prove not only her innocence, but also the truth behind the accusations. As the proceedings began, the prosecution laid out their weak arguments, trying to paint her as reckless and malicious. Each word they spoke seemed designed to break her spirit, but instead of crumbling, she listened intently, jotting down notes in her notebook. When it came time for cross-examination, she surprised everyone by dismantling the credibility of each witness with razor-sharp questions. Her calm yet confident demeanor caught the attention of everyone present. By the end of the session, murmurs filled the gallery. Who was this woman, and how did she manage to hold her ground so effectively? Though the battle had only just begun, one thing was clear: the judge had underestimated her, and that mistake might cost him dearly. The second day of the trial started with a tense atmosphere. The courtroom was packed and whispers buzzed among the spectators. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Would the quiet librarian crumble under pressure, or would she continue to surprise them? As the judge walked in, his expression was cold and calculating. He glanced at her briefly, then took his seat on the bench, looking down at everyone like he owned the room. From the moment the session began, it was clear that the judge wasn't going to make things easy for her. He interrupted her whenever she tried to speak, cutting her off mid-sentence with sharp remarks. "Do you even know what you're doing?" he snapped at one point, his voice dripping with mockery. "This isn't some book club meeting, you know." But instead of getting flustered, she stayed calm. She didn't raise her voice or argue back. Instead, she simply waited until he finished speaking, then replied in a steady tone. "Your Honor," she said respectfully, "I'm here to present my case based on facts and evidence. If I may be allowed to proceed without interruption, I believe we can move forward efficiently." Her words caught people off guard. They expected her to shrink under his bullying, but she stood firm. Even the bailiff raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her composure. The judge, however, wasn't pleased. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the desk, as if trying to figure out how to throw her off balance again. As the prosecution continued presenting their case, they brought up witnesses who claimed she had acted recklessly. One witness, a local businessman, accused her of spreading false rumors about the judge. But when it came time for cross-examination, she turned the tables completely. With careful precision, she asked questions that exposed inconsistencies in their stories. "Sir," she began, addressing the businessman, "you mentioned earlier that you heard these so-called rumors directly from me. Is that correct?" "Yes," he replied confidently. "And when exactly did this conversation take place?" she asked, flipping open her notebook. I don't remember the exact date," he stammered. She nodded slowly, letting the silence hang for a moment before continuing. "Interesting, because according to my records, and I kept detailed notes, you and I never spoke privately. In fact, our only interaction was during a public meeting where dozens of other people were present. Would you care to explain how you heard those rumors firsthand?" The man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing around the room. "Well, maybe someone else told me," he muttered finally. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. People exchanged glances, realizing she had just dismantled his testimony with simple logic. It wasn't flashy or dramatic. It was methodical and undeniable. And it worked. By lunchtime, the mood in the courtroom had shifted noticeably. The prosecution team huddled together, whispering urgently. They hadn't anticipated this level of preparation from someone without formal legal training. Meanwhile, the judge grew increasingly agitated. Every time she countered their arguments, his frustration became more apparent. He banged his gavel, harder than necessary, and made snide comments about wasting the court's time. Yet none of it seemed to faze her. After the break, she decided to go on the offensive. During her turn to present evidence, she pulled out a stack of documents bound neatly with paper clips. These weren't random papers. They were copies of emails, bank statements, and official records that hinted at shady dealings between the judge and the wealthy developer. While some details were redacted, the pattern was unmistakable. Money changing hands in exchange for favors. "This," she said, holding up one document, "is proof of communication between the accused parties. Notice the dates. They align perfectly with key decisions made by the court." The prosecutor objected immediately, calling the evidence irrelevant. But she wasn't deterred. Calmly, she cited specific rules of procedure, explaining why the documents were admissible. The judge scowled, clearly annoyed, but couldn't find a valid reason to dismiss them outright. For the first time, cracks appeared in his usually confident demeanor. As the afternoon wore on, the tension in the room reached a boiling point. The judge tried every trick in the book to regain control, interrupting her, dismissing her points as trivial, even accusing her of fabricating evidence. But each attempt only highlighted his desperation. Spectators watched in awe as she navigated the chaos with grace and intelligence, turning his tactics against him. One particularly heated exchange stood out. After yet another sarcastic remark from the judge, she paused, looked him straight in the eye, and said, "Your Honor, if I may remind you, Rule 611A requires judges to ensure fairness and efficiency in proceedings. If we are wasting time, perhaps it is because certain parties have failed to produce credible evidence, or worse, are deliberately obstructing justice." The room fell silent. Even the bailiff stopped shuffling papers, his pen frozen midair. No one dared breathe as the weight of her words sank in. The judge's face turned red, and for a brief moment, he looked like he might explode. But instead, he called for an abrupt recess, slamming his gavel down so hard it echoed through the chamber. As people filed out of the courtroom, conversations erupted. Some praised her courage, while others speculated about what would happen next. One elderly woman approached her timidly. "You're doing amazing," she whispered, patting her arm. "Don't give up." She smiled faintly, grateful for the support. But deep down, she knew the hardest part was still ahead. The judge wouldn't back down easily. He was cornered now, and desperate people often resorted to desperate measures. Still, she felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, she saw cracks in the wall of power that had oppressed her community for so long. Maybe, just maybe, she could bring it crashing down. When the session resumed later that afternoon, the air felt heavier, charged with anticipation. Whatever happened next would define not just her fate but the future of the entire town. By the third day of the trial, the courtroom felt like a pressure cooker ready to burst. The quiet librarian had already proven herself to be more than just an ordinary defendant. She was smart, composed, and relentless. But the judge wasn't, about to let her win without a fight. He came into the room that morning with a scowl on his face, looking angrier than ever. It was clear he'd spent the night plotting ways to regain control of the situation. As soon as the session began, he launched into another verbal attack. "This is ridiculous," he barked, glaring at her. "You're dragging this court through nonsense while wasting everyone's time. Do you even realize how serious these charges are?" She didn't flinch. Instead, she gave him a polite nod and replied calmly, "Your Honor, I understand the gravity of the situation. That's why I'm here. To present the truth and show that these charges have no basis in fact." Her calm response only seemed to irritate him further. He leaned forward, pointing a finger at her. "Truth? You call this circus the truth? Let me tell you something, you're out of your depth. Maybe you should consider settling this quietly before things get worse for you." The implication was obvious. Back down or face the consequences. But instead of cowering, she took a deep breath and responded firmly. "Your Honor, justice isn't served by intimidation or threats. If there's any wrongdoing, it deserves to be exposed, not swept under the rug." Her words hung in the air, earning murmurs of approval from the spectators. Even some members of the jury exchanged glances, clearly impressed by her courage. The judge, however, looked furious. He slammed his gavel down hard enough to make the sound echo through the room. "Enough. Let's move on." But moving on wasn't going to be easy for him anymore. She had prepared meticulously for this moment, and now it was time to play her strongest cards. During her turn to speak, she stood up slowly, gathering her notes. Then, with quiet confidence, she addressed the court. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "this case isn't just about me. It's about whether we allow fear and corruption to dictate our lives, or whether we stand up for what's right. I've presented evidence showing irregularities in certain decisions made by this court. Now I'd like to introduce additional documents that shed light on these matters." With that, she handed over a folder containing copies of emails and financial records. These weren't random pieces of paper. They were carefully selected to highlight patterns of misconduct. While some details were redacted, the overall picture was damning. Money transfers, secret meetings, and suspicious approvals all pointed to a web of deceit involving the judge and the wealthy developer. The prosecutor jumped up immediately, objecting loudly. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. These documents are hearsay and shouldn't be admitted as evidence." She remained unfazed. Calmly, she cited specific rules of evidence, explaining why the documents were admissible. Her knowledge of legal procedures stunned everyone in the room. Even the bailiff raised an eyebrow. The judge squirmed in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. He tried to wave off her arguments, but she countered each objection with precision, leaving him no room to maneuver. As the tension mounted, she decided to take things a step further. Turning to the jury, she spoke directly to them, appealing not just to their sense of logic but also their humanity. "Think about it," she said softly. If someone in power abuses their position, who will hold them accountable? Will we stay silent because it's easier? Or will we stand up and say, "No more"? Her voice carried emotion, and the room fell silent. Some jurors nodded subtly, while others scribbled notes furiously. It was clear her words were resonating. For the first time, the prosecution team looked worried. They huddled together, whispering urgently, trying to figure out how to counter her arguments. Meanwhile, the judge grew increasingly desperate. Every time she spoke, he interrupted her, accusing her of wasting time or distorting facts. But she refused to rise to the bait. Instead, she used his interruptions to her advantage, pointing out how his behavior contradicted the principles of fairness and impartiality. At one point, when he snapped at her for disrespecting the court, she simply smiled and replied, "Your Honor, respect is earned, not demanded, and true respect comes from acting with integrity." The gallery erupted in murmurs and the judge banged his gavel repeatedly, shouting for order. But the damage was done. His attempts to intimidate her were backfiring, making him look petty and biased. Even some of the court staff exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that the tide was turning. Later that afternoon, during a heated exchange, she delivered the final blow. Pulling out a single document, she held it up for everyone to see. "This is an email between the accused parties," she explained. "Notice the language. It explicitly mentions payments in exchange for favors. How can anyone argue that this isn't relevant to the case?" The prosecutor scrambled to object again, but the judge hesitated. He couldn't dismiss the document outright without appearing complicit himself. For a long moment, there was dead silence in the room. Then, reluctantly, he allowed the evidence to be entered into the record. As the day drew to a close, the atmosphere was electric. People lingered in the courtroom, buzzing with excitement. Some approached her timidly, offering words of encouragement. One elderly man patted her shoulder and said, "You're doing the Lord's work, young lady. Don't stop now." She smiled gratefully, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. But she knew the battle wasn't over yet. The judge was cornered, and desperate people often resorted to unpredictable actions. Still, she felt hopeful. For the first time, cracks were appearing in the wall of power that had oppressed her community for so long. That night, as she walked home under the stars, she replayed the day's events in her mind. She thought about the faces in the gallery, the mix of curiosity, admiration, and disbelief. She realized that this wasn't just her fight anymore. It had become a symbol of hope for others. And no matter what happened next, she vowed to keep pushing forward, one step at a time. The fourth day of the trial dawned with a heaviness in the air. Everyone could feel it. The tension was thicker than ever, like a storm about to break. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as people filed in, eager to see what would happen next. Some whispered that this might be the day when everything changed. Others wondered if the judge would finally crack under the pressure. One thing was certain: no one wanted to miss a moment of it. As the session began, the judge strode into the room looking more disheveled than usual. His usually slicked back hair was slightly messy, and his tie wasn't perfectly straight. It was a small detail, but it spoke volumes. For the first time, he seemed less confident, almost rattled. He took his seat and glared at the defendant, clearly trying to regain control of the narrative. "Let's get one thing clear," he barked, leaning forward on his bench. "This court will not tolerate games or distractions. If you have something meaningful to say, then say it. Otherwise, we're done here." She nodded politely, her expression calm and unreadable. Inside, though, she felt a surge of determination. She knew exactly what she needed to do today, to finish what she'd started. This was her chance to drive home the truth and expose the corruption once and for all. When it was her turn to speak, she stood up slowly, gathering her papers. Then, with quiet authority, she addressed the court. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I want to thank you for your patience so far. Today, I'll present additional evidence that ties everything together. These documents show a pattern of misconduct that cannot be ignored." With that, she handed over another set, of papers, emails, bank statements, and official records, all meticulously organized. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of how the judge had been accepting bribes from the wealthy developer in exchange for approving illegal projects. While some details were redacted, the connections were undeniable. Money flowed, in suspicious amounts, always timed just before key decisions were made. The prosecutor jumped up immediately, shouting objections. "Your Honor, these documents are hearsay. They're irrelevant and should not be admitted." But she didn't falter. Calmly, she cited specific legal rules, explaining why the evidence was admissible. Her knowledge of the law stunned everyone in the room. Even the bailiff raised an eyebrow. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly frustrated but unable to dismiss her arguments outright. Every time he tried to interrupt, she countered him with precise logic, leaving him trapped in his own web of bias. As the morning wore on, she turned her focus to the jury. Speaking softly but firmly, she appealed directly to their sense of justice. "Think about it," she said. "If someone abuses their power for personal gain, who suffers? Families lose their homes, communities are torn apart, and trust in our system erodes. Is that the kind of world we want to live in?" Her words struck a chord. Some jurors nodded thoughtfully, while others scribbled notes furiously. Even the spectators leaned forward, hanging on every word. For the first time, the prosecution team looked genuinely worried. They huddled together during breaks, whispering urgently, trying to figure out how to counter her arguments. But no matter what they came up with, she stayed one step ahead. By mid-afternoon, the judge's frustration reached a boiling point. Every attempt to discredit her only made him look worse. At one point, when she pointed out inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, he snapped, "Enough! You're twisting facts to suit your agenda." She paused, meeting his gaze steadily. "Your Honor," she replied evenly, "facts don't twist. They simply exist. What matters is whether we're brave enough to face them." The gallery erupted in murmurs, and the judge banged his gavel repeatedly, shouting for order. But the damage was done. His attempts to bully her were backfiring spectacularly, making him appear petty and unprofessional. Even some members of the court staff exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that the tide was turning. Later that afternoon, she delivered the final blow. Pulling out a single email, she held it up for everyone to see. "This message explicitly mentions payments in exchange for favors," she explained. "It's dated just days before a controversial decision was made. How can anyone argue that this isn't relevant?" The prosecutor scrambled to object again, but the judge hesitated. Dismissing the document outright would make him look complicit, and he knew it. For a long moment, there was dead silence in the room. Then, reluctantly, he allowed the evidence to be entered into the record. As the session drew to a close, the atmosphere was electric. People lingered in the courtroom, buzzing with excitement. Some approached her timidly, offering words of encouragement. One older woman clasped her hands and said, "You're fighting for all of us. Don't give up now." She smiled gratefully, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. But she knew the battle wasn't over yet. The judge was cornered, and desperate people often resorted to unpredictable actions. Still, she felt hopeful. For the first time, cracks were appearing in the wall of power that had oppressed her community for so long. That evening, as she walked home under the fading light, she replayed the day's events in her mind. She thought about the faces in the gallery, the mix of curiosity, admiration, and disbelief. She realized that this wasn't just her fight anymore. It had become a symbol of hope for others. And no matter what happened next, she vowed to keep pushing forward, one step at a time. Before going to bed, she opened her worn notebook and jotted down a few thoughts. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," she wrote. "It's choosing to act despite it." Closing the book, she took a deep breath and prepared herself for whatever lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but she was ready. The fifth day of the trial felt different right from the start. There was a buzz in the air, a sense that something big was about to happen. People arrived early, filling every seat in the courtroom. Some stood along the walls, craning their next to get a better view. Reporters jotted notes furiously, cameras clicked quietly, and even the bailiff seemed unusually alert. Everyone could feel it. This wasn't just another hearing. This was Judgment Day. As the session began, the judge entered the room looking more disheveled than ever. His tie was loose, his face pale, and there was a nervous twitch in his jaw. He avoided eye contact with anyone as he took his seat, gripping the edges of his bench like it might steady him. For the first time, he didn't open the proceedings with his usual arrogance. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and nodded for the prosecution to begin. The prosecutor stood up, visibly sweating despite the cool temperature in the room. He fumbled through his papers, stumbling over his words as he tried to summarize their case. It was clear they were running out of arguments. The evidence presented by the defendant had been overwhelming, and now they were scrambling to find anything to counter it. But every attempt fell flat. Their witnesses had already been discredited, their claims exposed as baseless. Even the jury looked bored, exchanging glances that spoke louder than words. When it was her turn to speak, she rose slowly, her movements deliberate and calm. She carried herself with quiet confidence, holding the attention of everyone in the room without saying a word. Finally, she began to address the court, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, "this case isn't just about me. It's about whether we allow fear and greed to dictate our lives, or whether we stand up for what is right. I've shown you emails, financial records, and official documents proving misconduct. These aren't random accusations. They're facts backed by evidence." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "But this isn't just about exposing wrongdoing. It's about sending a message that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law. If we let this slide, if we stay silent, then we're telling ourselves that justice doesn't matter, that corruption is okay as long as it doesn't affect us directly, and I refuse to accept that." Her voice grew stronger, more passionate as she spoke. "Every decision made in secret, every bribe accepted, every favor granted, it all adds up. Families lose their homes, communities suffer, trust erodes, and eventually we're left with nothing but a broken system. Is that what we want? Or do we choose to fight back?" The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Jurors leaned forward, hanging on every word. Spectators exchanged glances, nodding subtly in agreement. Even the bailiff wiped away a tear, though he quickly pretended to adjust his glasses. Her words weren't just an argument. They were a call to action, a reminder of why justice mattered. Behind the scenes, panic was brewing. During a short recess, the prosecutor pulled aside one of his colleagues, whispering urgently, "We need to settle this," he hissed. "If this goes any further, it'll destroy everything." Together, they approached her cautiously, offering to drop the charges if she agreed not to pursue further action against the judge or the developer. She listened patiently, her expression unreadable. When they finished speaking, she shook her head firmly. "No deal," she said simply. "This isn't about revenge. It's about accountability. If you walk away now, you're admitting guilt. Justice demands more than silence. It demands truth." Her refusal stunned them. They returned to their table, defeated, knowing they had no cards left to play. Meanwhile, the judge grew increasingly agitated. Every time she spoke, he interrupted her, accusing her of wasting time or distorting facts. But each interruption only made him look worse. Spectators whispered among themselves, openly criticizing his behavior. Even some members of the court staff shot him disapproving looks. Finally, it was time for closing statements. The prosecutor went first, delivering a weak and disjointed speech that barely addressed the mountain of evidence against him. When it was her turn, she delivered a master class in persuasion. Step by step, she walked the jury through the key points of the case, tying everything together with clarity and precision. "This isn't about winning or losing," she concluded. "It's about doing what's right. You have the power to make a difference, not just for me, but for everyone who believes in justice. Don't let fear or intimidation stop you from standing up for the truth." Her final words hung in the air, resonating deeply. As she sat down, the gallery erupted in applause. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, shouting for order, but it was too late. The momentum had shifted irreversibly. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The foreman stood up, cleared his throat, and announced, "Not guilty." The courtroom erupted in cheers, people standing up and clapping wildly. Tears streamed down her face as she bowed her head, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. It wasn't just a personal victory. It was a triumph for integrity and fairness. The judge, meanwhile, looked like he'd been struck by lightning. His face turned red, then white, as he struggled to maintain composure. For the first time, he seemed small and powerless. As the crowd celebrated around her, she realized something important. The real battle wasn't over yet. While the verdict proved her innocence, the larger fight for accountability still remained. That evening, as she walked home under the stars, she replayed the day's events in her mind. She thought about the faces in the gallery, the mix of joy, relief, and gratitude. She realized that this wasn't just her story anymore. It belonged to everyone who dared to believe in justice. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, she vowed to keep fighting. For herself, for her community, and for the countless others who deserved a fairer world. The days following the trial verdict felt surreal, like stepping out of a storm and into calm sunlight. The quiet librarian who had stood up to one of the most powerful figures in town suddenly found herself at the center of attention. People stopped her on the street, hugged her, thanked her, and told her she was a hero. But she didn't feel like a hero, just someone who had done what needed to be done. She knew that while the battle in court was over, the war against corruption wasn't. In the weeks after the trial, things began to change. Not just for her, but for the entire community. The judge's reputation was in tatters. Whispers turned into investigations as authorities dug deeper into his dealings with the wealthy developer. Evidence surfaced linking him to other shady transactions, not just the ones exposed during the trial. Facing mounting pressure, he resigned from the bench in disgrace. It wasn't long before news outlets picked up the story, turning it into a national headline. Small-town librarian takes down corrupt judge. While some celebrated the victory, others worried about backlash. The developer involved in the scandal tried to distance himself, claiming ignorance and innocence. But documents leaked online painted a clear picture of his role in the scheme. His business empire crumbled under public scrutiny, leaving behind empty promises and unfinished projects. For once, greed had been met with consequences. Despite the chaos swirling around them, the town started to heal. Families displaced by illegal land acquisitions received compensation. Environmental protections were reinstated, ensuring that green spaces wouldn't be destroyed for profit. People talked openly about how one person's courage had sparked a chain reaction, inspiring others to speak out against injustice. Conversations shifted from fear to hope, from silence to action, for her life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after such an extraordinary experience. She went back to work at the library, shelving books and helping patrons find stories they loved. Yet something had changed within her. She carried herself differently now, with a quiet strength that came from knowing she'd faced adversity, head-on, and won. Strangers approached her daily, asking for advice or sharing their own struggles. Some were victims of corruption. Others simply wanted guidance on standing up for themselves. She listened patiently, offering words of encouragement whenever she could. One day, as she sorted through a stack of donated books, she noticed a handwritten note tucked inside one of them. It read, "Thank you for reminding us that even the smallest voice can make a difference." The message brought tears to her eyes. She realized then that her fight had touched more lives than she ever imagined. But she didn't stop there. Determined to keep pushing for justice, she began mentoring young people interested in law and activism. Every Saturday morning, she hosted informal sessions at the library, teaching them about legal procedures, ethics, and the importance of speaking truth to power. Her classes became so popular that local schools invited her to speak at assemblies. Teachers praised her ability to connect with students, calling her a natural-born leader. Her efforts extended beyond education. She joined forces with community groups working to hold officials accountable, Together, they organized town hall meetings where residents could voice concerns without fear of retaliation. Slowly but surely, trust began to rebuild between the people and those meant to serve them. Transparency replaced secrecy, and collaboration replaced exploitation. Years passed, and the town transformed in ways no one thought possible. Parks flourished, where buildings once loomed. Families moved back, drawn by the promise of fairness and opportunity. And though the scars of corruption remained, they served as reminders of how far they'd come, and how much farther they still had to go. On the anniversary of the trial, a group of townspeople gathered outside the courthouse to unveil a plaque dedicated to her bravery. Engraved in bold letters were the words, "To the woman who reminded us all that no one is above the law." As she stood there, surrounded by friends and strangers alike, she felt humbled. This wasn't about recognition, it was about collective progress. Later that evening, she walked home alone, reflecting on everything that had happened. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would still be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But she took comfort in knowing she wasn't alone anymore. A movement had begun, one rooted in courage, integrity, and unity. Before heading to bed, she opened her worn notebook, flipping through pages filled with notes, thoughts, and memories. On the last blank page, she wrote a single sentence: "Justice begins when we choose to care." Closing the book, she smiled softly, feeling grateful for the journey and hopeful for the future. As she drifted off to sleep, she dreamed of shelves lined with stories waiting to be told. Stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Stories of resilience, hope, and triumph. And somewhere among them, perhaps, was her own. A tale of quiet determination that proved even the smallest voice could echo louder than any storm.